No wells, no warnings, just instinct, memory, and mastery of the land. Native Americans found drinkable water in dead zones. But what signs were they reading that most of us wouldn't even recognize as life-saving? Long before anyone worried about water filters or bottled water, Native American tribes had already figured out the secret to staying hydrated in some pretty tough places. And let me tell you, they didn't mess around when it came to finding the good stuff. Rivers were the obvious choice, right? Fast-moving water stays cleaner than the stuff sitting around collecting who knows what. But here's where it gets interesting. They weren't just grabbing water from any old spot along the riverbank. These folks knew exactly which bends had the cleanest flow and which sections to avoid completely. Smart thinking, considering they didn't have fancy laboratories to test their water quality. Then, there were the springs. Now we're talking about the champagne of natural water sources. Springs bubbled up from deep underground, naturally filtered through layers of rock and sand. The water stayed cool in summer, didn't freeze solid in winter, and tasted better than anything you'd find sitting in a lake. Makes sense, right? But here's the really impressive part. Entire tribes memorized spring locations across hundreds of miles. We're talking about a mental GPS system that would put modern hikers to shame. They'd know exactly where to find fresh water 3 days' walk from camp, or which springs stayed reliable during the driest months. Some of these water sources were so dependable that whole villages sprouted up nearby. Why wander around looking for water when you could just set up shop next to nature's own drinking fountain? Well, speaking of smart choices, these tribes had figured out something that took European settlers a lot longer to learn. Stagnant water will make you sick faster than you can say stomach cramps. Ponds that didn't move much? Nope. Water with green stuff floating on top? Hard pass. They connected the dots between bad water and feeling awful long before anyone understood bacteria. And the weird part is, they didn't need microscopes to know which water was trouble. They used their senses. Smell funky? Don't drink it. Look cloudy or have an oily film. Keep walking. Water that didn't attract healthy wildlife? Red flag. It's like they had built-in quality control that modern campers would kill for. Lakes presented their own challenge. Big lakes with waves and movement. Usually okay, especially if you grabbed water from the deeper parts away from shore. But those shallow, warm spots where the water barely moved, that's where the nasty stuff liked to hang out and multiply. Let's not forget that different seasons meant different strategies. Spring snowmelt could make rivers run muddy and fast, not ideal for drinking. Late summer might mean lower water levels and more concentrated, let's call it natural flavoring from upstream animals. These tribes tracked seasonal patterns like meteorologists, knowing exactly when and where to find the cleanest sources. Some springs were so treasured, they became landmarks for trade routes and territorial boundaries. Imagine fighting over a water source instead of oil. Though I suppose clean water might be more valuable than we think these days. But what happened when springs ran dry or winter made rivers impossible to reach? That's where things got really creative, and Native Americans had some tricks up their sleeves that might surprise you. When winter hit and rivers froze solid, Native tribes didn't just sit around waiting for spring. They had snow and ice everywhere, but here's the thing most people don't realize. Eating snow straight up is about as smart as jumping into a freezer naked. Your grandmother probably told you never to eat snow because it's dirty. Well, she was half right, but the real danger wasn't the dirt. Eating frozen snow sucks the heat right out of your body faster than you can say hypothermia. Native people figured this out thousands of years before anyone invented thermometers. So what did they do instead? They got creative with fire and rocks. Northern tribes would heat stones in their fires until they were blazing hot, then carefully drop these heated rocks into containers filled with snow. The snow would melt instantly, creating perfectly drinkable water without losing precious body heat. Pretty clever, right? No fancy equipment needed, just rocks, fire, and common sense. But here's where it gets really interesting. These folks didn't use just any container. They'd fashion water holders from animal hides, thick bark, or even tightly woven baskets. The heated rock method worked so well that entire families could melt enough snow for drinking, cooking, and cleaning in just a few minutes. Then there's the ice selection process. Not all ice is created equal, and Native tribes knew this like the back of their hand. Clean, clear freshwater ice from rivers and lakes? Perfect. That murky, salty stuff near coastal areas? Absolutely not. They could spot bad ice from a mile away. saving themselves from stomach troubles that could kill during harsh winters. And the weird part is how they transported this melted snow water. Ever seen a bison stomach? Well, it makes one heck of a water container. These natural bladders could hold gallons of water and were completely leak-proof. Talk about using every part of the animal. Nothing went to waste. Some tribes got so good at the snow-melting game, they could do it while traveling. Long winter hunts meant being away from rivers and streams for weeks. No problem. They'd set up temporary melting stations using portable fire setups and pre-selected rocks. The whole process took maybe 15 minutes, and they'd have fresh water for days. The timing mattered too. Melting snow during the warmest part of the day meant less fuel needed and faster results. These people understood energy conservation long before anyone coined the term. What really blows my mind is how they knew which snow to avoid. Yellow snow? Obviously no, but they also stayed away from snow that had been sitting around too long or looked grainy and weird. Fresh powder from recent storms was their gold standard. The heated rock technique was so effective that some tribes preferred it over breaking through thick river ice. Why struggle with an axe for an hour when you could have hot rocks melting snow in minutes? Makes perfect sense when you think about it. But what happened when there wasn't any snow or ice around and the nearest river was days away? That's when things got really interesting and native ingenuity reached levels that would make modern survival experts jealous. When you're stuck in a desert with your water running low, most people panic. Native Americans? They looked around and saw liquid gold everywhere. Trees, cacti, even innocent-looking vines became their personal water fountains. Desert tribes had this down to a science. They'd slice open a barrel cactus like they were cutting into a watermelon at a family picnic. The pulp inside held enough moisture to keep someone alive for days. Prickly pear cacti were another favorite. Messy to handle, but worth the effort when your throat felt like sandpaper. And those massive saguaro cacti? Think of them as nature's water towers, storing gallons of life-saving liquid in their thick stems. But here's where it gets interesting. Northern tribes weren't about to let their southern cousins have all the fun with plant water. They discovered that maple trees were basically offering free drinks every spring. Makes sense, right? We still tap maple trees today for syrup, but back then, that sweet sap meant hydration and energy rolled into one package. Birch trees work the same way. One small cut in the bark, and you'd get a steady drip of clear, mineral-rich water. Some tribes could collect several quarts from a single tree without harming it. Talk about sustainable living. They figured out renewable water sources centuries before anyone coined that term. Then there were the sneaky water sources that most people would walk right past. Wild grapevines held surprising amounts of moisture in their stems. Cut a section about arm's length, hold it above your mouth, and fresh water would drip out. Simple as that. Bulrushes growing near wetlands were like natural straws. Cut the stem, suck gently, and you'd get cool water drawn up from the marshy ground below. Even willow branches, especially the younger ones, contained enough moisture to help during dry spells. Native people learned to identify which plants were full of water just by looking at them. The really clever part? They knew timing mattered. Early morning was perfect for plant water extraction because overnight dew and natural plant processes meant maximum moisture content. Cut into a cactus at noon versus dawn, and you'd notice the difference immediately. Different regions called for different techniques. Southwest tribes became experts at reading cacti, knowing which ones were ready to harvest and which ones to leave alone. Forest dwellers mastered the art of tree tapping without killing their water sources. Coastal groups learned that certain beach grasses held fresh water even when surrounded by salt spray. And here's something that might surprise you. They rarely relied on just one plant source. Smart tribes always had backup plans. If the nearest barrel cactus was dried out, they'd know exactly which vines to check next. The knowledge wasn't just about extraction either. They understood which plants provided the cleanest water and which ones might carry risks. Some plant waters tasted better than others, and some provided extra nutrients that bodies needed during long journeys. Well, speaking of long journeys, getting water from plants was great when you found them. But what happened when Native Americans needed to stay hydrated for days or weeks on the trail? You know what's funny about survival shows today? They make finding water seem like rocket science. Meanwhile, native tribes had another ace up their sleeve that most people never think about. They ate their water. Sounds weird, right? But here's the thing your great-grandmother probably knew and we forgot. Food is loaded with water. A juicy apple, that's about 85% water. Wild berries? Even better. The tribes figured this out centuries before we started obsessing over 8 glasses a day. Wild strawberries were like nature's water bottles. Blackberries, huckleberries, elderberries. These weren't just snacks during a tough journey. They were liquid gold wrapped in natural sugar. Smart, isn't it? You get energy and hydration in one tiny package. But berries weren't the only trick. Desert tribes knew something that would blow your mind. Cactus fruit, or tunas as they called them, could keep you alive for days. These bright red and purple gems from prickly pear cactus packed serious water content. Plus, they tasted pretty darn good, which beats chewing on tree bark any day. Then there were roots. Oh boy, the roots! Wild onions, Jerusalem artichokes, and even dandelion roots held surprising amounts of moisture. Tribes would dig these up during dry spells, getting both nutrition and hydration from the same source. 2 birds, 1 stone, that's the efficiency our ancestors mastered. And the weird part is, meat was also a water source. Yep, you heard that right. Fresh deer liver, kidney, even muscle tissue contains tons of water. When you're stuck in the wilderness and find a fresh kill, you're not just getting protein, you're getting liquid too. Organ meats especially. They're like little water balloons wrapped in nutrition. Some tribes carried something called pinole, basically dried cornmeal ground super fine. Why? Because when they did find water later, they could mix it up for an instant meal. But here's the clever bit. If they found water-rich foods instead, the pinole could wait. They'd munch on juicy plant stems or cactus pads and save their dry goods for another day. Wild grapes were another favorite. Have you ever bitten into a really ripe wild grape? It practically explodes with juice. Desert tribes would follow grapevines like treasure maps, knowing each cluster meant both food and drink rolled into one sweet package. But wait, there's more. Certain plants were basically nature's sports drinks. Wild mint leaves, when chewed, provided moisture, plus a cooling effect. Clover flowers held tiny drops of nectar. Even grass, yes, regular grass, could be chewed for its moisture content, though I wouldn't recommend making it your main course. The really smart part? These foods didn't just provide water, they provided clean water. Unlike questionable pond water that might make you sick, the water locked inside plants and fresh meat was naturally filtered and safe to consume. Native people understood something we're just rediscovering. Hydration doesn't always come from a cup. Sometimes it comes disguised as dinner. Speaking of clever survival tactics, did you know these same tribes had mastered the art of using animals as their personal GPS system for finding water? Getting lost in the wilderness without water? Your life might depend on watching where the animals go. Native tribes figured out centuries ago that following animal behavior was like having a GPS to hidden water sources. Pretty smart when you think about it. Animals need water every single day, just like us. Animal trails weren't random wandering paths. They were highways leading straight to water. Deer, elk, and buffalo all follow the same routes to their favorite drinking spots, wearing down clear paths through the forest or across open plains. Well, these trails became treasure maps for thirsty travelers. But here's where it gets interesting. Different animals drink at different times, and knowing this could save your hide. Deer usually head to water twice a day, early morning and just before dark. So if you spotted fresh deer tracks heading downhill around sunset, you'd better follow them fast. Then there were the flying guides. Birds, especially small songbirds, rarely venture more than a mile from water. When you see them flying in a straight line at dawn or dusk, they're commuting between their roosting spots and their water source. Doves and pigeons, even more reliable. These guys fly directly to water every morning like they're punching a time clock. Bees became the ultimate water detectives. Native scouts knew that honeybees never stray more than 3 miles from water and usually stay much closer. Following a bee's flight path was like following a breadcrumb trail. The trick was watching them carefully. Bees flying away from flowers were likely heading to water, while those heading toward flowers were just doing their regular job. And the weird part is how accurate this bee method really was. Some tribes could find hidden springs this way that they never would have discovered otherwise. Makes you wonder why we don't teach this stuff in school anymore, right? Fresh animal droppings told their own story too. Soft, moist droppings meant animals had been drinking recently, and water was definitely close by. Old, dried-out dung, keep moving. Those animals had traveled far from their last drink. Let's not forget about the ant highways. Certain types of ants form long, single-file lines leading to water sources. Following these tiny marching bands could lead you to seeps and springs hidden under rocks or vegetation. It takes patience, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Even the behavior of animals gave away water secrets. Restless cattle or horses in the evening usually meant they were getting ready to head to their watering hole. Buffalo wallowing in dirt often did it near water sources where they could cool off afterward. But the most reliable sign? Multiple species using the same trail. When deer paths, rabbit runs, and bird flight patterns all pointed in the same direction, you could bet your last piece of jerky that water was waiting at the end of that trail. The beauty of this animal tracking system was that it worked year-round, in any climate. Desert animals, forest creatures, mountain wildlife, they all needed water and all left clues about where to find it. Of course, finding water was only half the battle. Once you located it, you needed ways to store and carry it for the journey ahead. Once you found water in the wilderness, keeping it safe became your next survival challenge. Native Americans mastered this art thousands of years before plastic bottles existed, and honestly, their methods put our modern water storage to shame. Animal bladders were the original water bottles. Buffalo, elk, and deer bladders worked perfectly once cleaned and prepared properly. The process wasn't exactly pleasant. You had to carefully remove the bladder without puncturing it, then flush it clean with fresh water. But here's the brilliant part. These natural containers were lightweight, flexible, and could hold several quarts of water. Much better than trying to carry water in your cupped hands for 20 miles. Then there were gourds, nature's own water jugs. Tribes would grow bottle gourds specifically for water storage, hollowing them out, and sometimes adding wooden stoppers. These worked so well that some families passed down the same gourd containers for generations. Talk about sustainable living before it was trendy. But the real engineering marvel? Woven baskets lined with pine pitch. Sounds impossible, right? How does a basket hold water? Native craftspeople would weave tight baskets from willow or other flexible materials, then coat the inside with heated pine pitch or tree sap. This created a waterproof seal that could last for years. The pitch even helped purify the water slightly and gave it a pleasant woodsy taste. Pottery offered another brilliant solution, especially for permanent camps. Clay pots could be buried partially underground, keeping water naturally cool even during blazing summer days. The earth acted like a primitive refrigerator, maintaining perfect drinking temperatures without any electricity. Some tribes made enormous storage jars that could supply an entire family for weeks. For long hunting expeditions, warriors carried water in specially prepared stomach sacks from large animals. These were tougher than bladders and could withstand rough handling during travel. Imagine explaining that to your hiking buddies today. Hey guys, I brought water in a bison stomach. The reactions would be priceless. The genius wasn't just in the containers themselves, but in preventing contamination. Sealed baskets and pottery kept out insects, dust, and debris. Many containers had narrow necks that made it nearly impossible for bugs to crawl inside. Smart design without a single engineering degree in sight. Storage locations mattered too. Water containers were often hung from tree branches or placed on elevated platforms, keeping them away from ground moisture and curious animals. Some tribes dug special cache pits lined with stones, creating underground water storage that stayed hidden from enemies and protected from weather. Well, here's what amazes me most. These traditional methods were so effective that many indigenous communities still use them today. Not because they have to, but because they work better than modern alternatives in certain situations. That pine pitch basket technique, still practiced by traditional craftspeople who understand that sometimes the old ways are the best ways. The durability of these containers puts our disposable culture to shame. While we throw away millions of plastic bottles yearly, Native Americans used the same water storage vessels for decades. They understood something we're just rediscovering. Quality craftsmanship beats convenience every single time. These weren't just survival tools, they were lifelines that meant the difference between thriving and merely surviving in unforgiving landscapes.